and welcome to Current Affairs on JTV, the global Jewish channel. Today I'm here with Colonel Richard Kemp, who's a former commander of British forces in Afghanistan. Richard, delighted to have you with us today. I'm going to start with a subject that has often caused some consternation in international circles, which is, if you like, the morality of the Israel Defence Forces. You've been quite outspoken in your defence of the way they operate. Do you think they are the most moral army in the world?
I think they're certainly extremely moral. I think they take greater steps than any other army in the world or indeed in history to minimise the loss of civilian life on the battlefield.
Greater steps than any other, more than the British, more than the Americans?
More than anyone, and partly that is partly because of the way their enemy fight. Their enemy deliberately try and lure them to kill their own civilians, in other words, Palestinian civilians, in a way that goes even beyond the way that Hamas, the Taliban and Al-Qaeda and other enemies we've fought try and do that to us. They use human shield, not so much to prevent the Israelis from attacking their positions, but to try and force the Israelis to attack their positions and kill those human shields. That's one of the things Israel is well aware of and has to guard against, and therefore it has to take these steps. And also because of the nature of Gaza, for example, the layout of Gaza and the Israelis' deep knowledge of Gaza, they're able to go much further than most other forces are in operating perhaps in vast areas and unfamiliar areas.
So the knowledge area is quite key on this. So for example, when British forces were in Afghanistan, were in Iraq, the lack of local knowledge you felt meant that we were a little less careful, shall we say, with civilian lives?
Well, it didn't let us do some of the things the Israelis do. For example, they will send text messages to people who live in buildings that they want to target, or they'll phone them up. Of course, we have no facility normally to do that in other combat zones. So that's one edge the Israelis have. But they're also very determined because they recognise the extent to which approbation will be poured down upon them if they do kill too many civilians. But of course,
you're almost suggesting the Israelis would like to kill more civilians, but...
Yeah, well, absolutely not. I mean, I was going to come on to say that there is also the moral issue. And I think one reason why I believe that the IDF is such a moral army is the difference between the IDF, for example, and the British Army. The British Army, if you join the British Army, you join because you want to fight. You're gung-ho, you're aggressive, you're that kind of person. That's why I joined the British Army, because I wanted to fight. And I wanted to fight throughout my career. And I succeeded in doing so in many occasions. But if you join the IDF, you join the IDF because you have to, because everybody joins it, because you've got to defend and protect your immediate home and your country. So you don't join it because you want to be a soldier. In most cases, one or two are. Most of them, they want to be computer experts, they want to be doctors, lawyers, teachers, whatever it might be. And they have to do their stint in the forces. And the other issue, I think, which is also important, is Judaism. Now, we all know that the vast majority of Israelis are not practicing Jews, but nevertheless, Judaism permeates the whole of Israeli society, including the IDF, in a way that Christianity doesn't permeate the UK any longer. So you do have, I think, a greater level of restraint and morality among Israeli soldiers than any other army.
How much of that is, if you like, legally constrained? We all know the role of legal advisors. In your studies of the IDF over the years, could you explain a little bit about how the legal advice issue comes in and compare it perhaps with the British and American armies?
Well, I think all of our armies, British, American, Israeli and others, have a huge amount of emphasis today on ensuring that we operate within the law. And it's not just operating at the edge of the law, on the boundary of the law. We all operate with a margin inside the law so that we can ensure that when mistakes are made, which inevitably they will be made, it hopefully doesn't take us outside the laws of armed conflict.
Well, I think there's a key thing when you look at mistakes. Now, obviously, all armies make mistakes, and there are obviously outcries afterwards. Why is it that so much, do you think, is being made of when Israelis, for example, target, but when they hit, for example, a hospital every now and again or a school, that so much is made of that, even when it's quite obvious that there are military targets in those places, and that is what the Israelis are targeting?
I think there's a difference between a mistake caused by either genuine human error, technical failure, battlefield confusion, which is obviously a cause of many mistakes, and stresses and pressures. The difference between that and deliberately targeting an area where there are civilians. And if every army has to do that because the enemy in every conflict today fights among civilians. It is legal to attack a target when there are civilians there, even if you know that some of those civilians or all of those civilians are going to die. As long as you don't deliberately target them specifically, as long as you're targeting a military objective and you make a calculation based on the laws of armed conflict, predominantly whether or not your action will be proportionate, the damage you're going to do to innocent civilians will be proportionate to your military objective, then it is lawful to do it. And contrary to what most people think, which is that if you kill innocent civilians, it's a war crime, and it's not a war crime. So that's not necessarily a war crime.
No, not necessarily, as you say. Now, so that's interesting. We have the concept of legality there, and we have the concept of morality, both of which you say the Israelis pass with flying colours on that score. So why is it then? Why is it that we have repeated outbursts from individuals? The most recent one I can think of is Ken Livingstone, who, in defence of a Labour Member of Parliament who had shared an anti-Semitic, anti-Israeli post, had said, well, you have to remember the context. It's when Israel was massacring civilians. Why is that view out there?
Well, before I answer that question, can I just make the point that what I've said up to now is not only my view, it is my strong view, but I was a member of a group of 13 international senior military officers, mostly generals, from Germany, France, Australia, India, the United States of America, and other countries, who went and investigated the IDF's actions in Gaza. Mm-hmm. They were given unprecedented access to all levels, from the Prime Minister right the way down to commanders on the ground. And they came to the same conclusion, that the IDF did not commit war crimes during that conflict. Quite the opposite, Hamas was committing the war crimes. And that view was backed up also by General Dempsey, the former chairman of the US Joint Chiefs of Staff, who recently said that Israel took amazing steps to prevent the loss of civilian life, and the Americans would try and emulate it, and they have tried to emulate it as well. They've learned lessons from what the Israelis did. But coming to your question, it comes down, to my mind, to a large extent, to a combination of two things. One of them is a wide scale, probably the greatest slur campaign in the history of the world against Israel that's been organised and carefully planned and driven from the Middle East by Arab countries, by Palestinians themselves, and supported in the media, supported in the West, to demonise Israel, to isolate Israel. It's the only way that they can actually score hits against Israel. They know they can't beat them militarily, so they have to do it through propaganda. And the second dimension is anti-Semitism. It's no longer fashionable to be an anti-Semitic in this country. It is very fashionable to be an anti-Zionist or to be anti-Israel. And in my opinion, there is a huge overlap. In fact, almost the two things, anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism, are identical.
So bearing in mind what you've said, if somebody says in public, Israel is massacring Palestinian civilians, you would call them an anti-Semite?
I would call them, on the basis of everything I've seen and everything I've studied, and I was in Israel for both of the last two Gaza conflicts. I know the IDF extremely well. I know many of their commanders. And I know many of their soldiers, some of whom come from Britain and from the United States of America. And I know that's not the way they operate. I know that they don't commit that sort of crime. So I would call them either grossly mistaken or, more likely, deliberately trying to tell lies about the IDF.
What are we to make of the fact that just to the north of Israel there's an ongoing conflict in Syria, where you've seen some of the worst cases of barbarism in terms of the way armies have been conducting themselves? Obviously, the armies of dictator Assad with barrel bombs, issues like that. But even the Russians, when they came in, there appears to have been no attempt to distinguish between civilian and military targets, and yet the world is silent.
Well, it's really the same as when Hamas carry out attacks against Israeli civilians, or indeed slaughter their own people, which they do fairly frequently. The world is silent on that. When it comes to the Middle East, the only real criminal on the block is Israel. And if you look at the number of UN resolutions against Israel compared to the number of UN resolutions against countries such as Syria, it's almost, if it wasn't so horrific, it would be laughable. And unfortunately, it comes back down to that same thing. The anti-Israel conspiracy, generated over years and supported in the media, in human rights organizations, universities, and various political groups, and the anti-Semitic aspect.
And you've been targeted yourself, haven't you? You faced criticism and worse for having defended Israel.
I've been the subject of many protests, including in Australia, in this country, in the United States of America, when I've been talking about Israel. Other issues, you don't get the protest. It's not me me they're protesting about. It's what I say about Israel. And I've also been subject to anti-Semitic hatred.
But it is you, because you are also a legitimate source. As somebody who's giving legitimacy from your military background, they're targeting you specifically.
Indeed, they are. But the point I was making really was that it's because of the subject. When I talk about Afghanistan, when I talk about Iraq, there's a different approach to it. It's all to do with Israel. It's all the desire by so many of these anti-Israeli groups to shut down anything that's being said about Israel in a positive way. Unless you're against Israel, you're automatically wrong, you're automatically bigoted, you're prejudiced, you're beyond the pale. And that applies to anybody, whether they're Jewish, whether they're Israeli, whether they're not. And it really does act as a strong deterrent, which it's intended to, against non-Jews and non-Israelis, and indeed sometimes Jews, speaking up in favour of Israel.
Given all this, why is it that a country like Israel, which, as you say, follows all these codes of conduct, gets criticised so heavily in our society here? Is that a sickness in our society that it feels so compelled to condemn Israel, while a country like Iran, for example, the same neighbourhood, supporting terrorism, abusing human rights, gets a clean bill of health?
I think, first of all, I should make the point that the British government and our Prime Minister, I believe, are strong supporters of Israel and have said so openly and publicly. And the relationships between our military, for example, and intelligence service, as well as trade relationships, are extremely strong. And in fact, in some cases, stronger than they've ever been before. So there is a solid support and backing for Israel in this country.
Sure, but people are rushing to embrace Iran with a trade deal, for example, and they're rushing to, in some cases, boycott Israel.
There are two issues there, I think. One is that in relation to the EU, our government, by custom, tends to vote on foreign policy issues as a bloc with the EU, and it's a question of detecting and influencing the European mood. And many countries in Europe do not hold the same opinion of Israel as we do, and therefore that often causes our approach to be sometimes diluted by other European countries. The second issue is, I think, the increasing Muslim population in this country. Many Muslims, and not all Muslims, many Muslims are vehemently anti-Israel, and it's almost in their DNA. There are many of them brought up and taught almost from the cradle, as they are in Palestine, taught to be opposed to the state of Israel. And that influences some of our politicians and some of our leaders in other parts of society. And it's two issues. First of all, the fact that the Islamic vote is powerful at the ballot box, and secondly, Islamic extremism, which has affected this country badly over the years. There have been many plots, and there have been even more disrupted plots. And some of our politicians, by no means all of our politicians, but some of them, do feel a need to appease that Muslim mood and to themselves condemn Israel in order to appease the...
And you're saying they're doing this to stop extremist attacks?
It's partly that. It's partly to, in the case of some MPs, to keep their seats, and it's partly just generally to keep perhaps an air of balance within society, to try and avoid antagonising Muslims who they know are opposed to Israel.
Well, where does this leave us as a country?
I think it leaves us in a very difficult position, given that the Islamic population and their power at the ballot box is increasing, is constantly increasing, and I think this desire and this will to appease their anti-Israel feeling, I think that can only lead to perhaps a worse situation than we face now, except that unless we get much stronger leadership than we have. We need that. The key thing to put us in the right direction is leadership.
I think it's interesting you raise that, because no less a commentator than Mehdi Hassan, a very prominent British Muslim, has spoken of anti-Semitism, for example, as being the guilty little secret of the Muslim community. So if what you say is indeed correct, we do face some interesting, trying times. And lastly, the relationship between anti-Semitism and anti-Israel feeling. You commented on it before, but in the context of the Muslim community, do you think that's a given?
I think, without a doubt, I mean, and as you say, Mehdi Hassan himself has confirmed this, that it is very, very strong in most parts of the Muslim society here in the UK, and that accounts really for the vast majority of anti-Semitism that we face here. There is some indigenous anti-Semitism, there always has been. It's nothing like it used to be, but it's on the up, and it's on the up because of the Muslim population here and because of those people who want to appease the Muslims in this country.
Well, Richard, that's all we've got time for. Thank you very much for joining me, and thank you all at home. We'll see you again soon for another session of Current Affairs on JTV.